Welcome back. My guest today on this third episode of the mini-series, It's Not What They Told You, is definitely one of the thinkers, authors, and commentators that have really enlightened me about some of the realities of today's economy. John Rubino is a financial analyst by training. He is, as I said, an author and a commentator known for his criticism or critique of global economics and specifically in relationship to debt. John is he started his career on as a Wall Street financial analyst, and he became an author or a co-author of 5 books. Two of my favorites are The Money Bubble and The Collapse of the Dollar. He founded dollarcollapse.com in 2004 and sold it in 2022, and he now has the John Rubens Substack, where he shares a lot of his thoughts about the economy. John is not shy to be brutally honest about what's happening. So I have to say that today's conversation is going to be a little bit shocking for some of you in terms of the reality of how fragile the economic realities that we've created over the last 50 years have become. And so I have to say, for the faint-hearted, I have to give a bit of warning. This is 18 plus. This is going to scare you. And I don't mean to scare you, and I don't want to scare you. But I really have to say that a lot of people have to wake up to the financial realities of what we're about to start embarking upon, especially in the US and slightly also in other Western countries. So please accept my apology for scaring you a little bit as I speak to one of my favorite teachers about the economy that we are about to experience, John Rubino. John, thank you so much for being here today. Really, really wonderful to have you. Lots to talk about today.
Thanks, Mo. It's great to meet you. And yeah, you're right. There is a lot to talk about these days.
I know it is. It is actually a very confusing time. Right? Most people in the last 2 to 3 years just felt a massive increase in the cost of everything. Everyone is really struggling to make sense of where all of this is coming from. The newspaper headlines will talk about inflation, but what is causing the inflation and so on. And my hope for today is for, the everyday person to sort of understand that this is not a problem that started a year or two ago, that this is a very, it goes back a very long way. I think, I probably say 1971, 1945, maybe even earlier than that. So would you start us off with an understanding of, for the non-economist of the world, where does this start? Where do the challenges we have with money begin?
Well, today's challenges, and they are huge. To understand them probably requires a trip all the way back to the conception of money. What is money? And
Yes,
because you
great
can't
question.
understand how because we've screwed it up, but we know we have to know what it is to understand how we've screwed things up. So let's go all the way back to the beginnings of human civilization. Every culture starts out doing barter, basically trading things back and forth. If I've got arrowheads and you've got beaver pelts, we get together and cut a deal, since we both need on some level arrowheads and beaver pelts. But as societies get more complex, that process gets a lot more complicated. Now, for instance, if you're a speech therapist and you need pork chops, then you can't just barter one for the other very easily. So every society, as it becomes more complex, designates something to serve the function of money, which is kind of a go-between and a communications medium. It allows everybody to have a shared conception of value and to convey that conception in a way that everybody understands. And that makes it possible to do speech therapy and then gain money for doing that, and then use that money to buy those pork chops.
Correct.
And so it's completely necessary as a tool for a modern society. But early on, we didn't know exactly what should be money. So everything got tried: seashells and big stone discs and bales of tea and human slaves and animals. And turns out most of those things, for various reasons, don't work very well as money. in a lot of cases because you can't chop them up to make change out of them very easily.
Yeah.
So
Or
most
because you
societies,
can't carry them around very, very easily.
yeah, that too, and so it just those things didn't work. They got tried, they got abandoned, and most societies settled on pieces of metal like copper or silver or gold because those things could be fungible. You can make up millions of them in the same size, and then everybody kind of understands what they're getting when they sell something for copper or silver or gold. And in the longer term, gold and silver turned out to be the rarest and among the most durable kinds of money. And they ended up being society's money for thousands of years. You can go all the way back to the Egyptians and maybe before to find gold and silver being highly valued stores of value. In other words, you get some gold and silver, and it's going to hold its value for however long you need it to hold it. And so 100 years later, your ancestors come back or your successors come back, and that gold and silver that you put away is still valuable.
Mm.
So that's the way it stayed for thousands of years. Most of human civilization was on what is called a gold standard, sometimes a silver standard, but usually a gold standard, where gold was the money. Sometimes societies would create pieces of paper or something like that to represent the gold that the government held in trust to back its money. But it was understood that paper was a representation of the real money, which was gold.
Money. Yeah.
And so that went on for such a long time that everybody just assumed that was the environment. Gold was money, and that was that. But with time, governments started to be frustrated by the fact that money was a real thing, and if they wanted to invade a neighbor or to buy off a constituency for an election or whatever, they had to go out and get real money. And that limited their ability to do the things they wanted, and it was very frustrating. So every once in a while, a government would try to get around the idea of gold as being real money, and they would create paper currency that wasn't backed by anything. And human nature being what it is, they would issue too many pieces of paper currency. There would be a boom, but then there would be a bust when the value of that paper currency just collapsed. But that always happened in the context of a sound money world, sound money being something that's real and that governments can't just make more of out of thin air. So that one currency would collapse, but everybody else would be on the gold standard, and it would be not that big of a deal. Lately, though, in 1971, in fact, we tried an experiment. The human race tried an experiment where we took all the major currencies off the remnants of the gold standard. In other words, their currencies were no longer linked to gold. They weren't representations of gold. They were just pieces of paper or electronic impulses that were whatever the government said they were.
So let me just make sure that everyone understands this. Before 1971, and mainly since I think 1945, when Bretton Woods started tying everything to the dollar, while the dollar is tied to gold, you couldn't have an extra dollar in the market unless you had the amount of gold that corresponded to it. Correct?
You could have extra dollars in the market, and that's what broke the system down, is that you can create more dollars, but people have to trust those dollars.
Uh-huh.
So you can create more up to a certain point, but once you go beyond that point, people stop trusting that this dollar that they have in their hand is actually functionally backed by gold. In other words, that you can convert it into gold anytime you want. And then they start trying to convert it into gold, right? And
correct. Yeah. Once the trust is lost, you sort of tell yourself, I want my real money, not that piece of paper.
Yes. Yeah. So in 1971, as you said, there was an agreement prior to that called the Bretton Woods Agreement that set up basically a dollar standard. The dollar was linked to gold, but all the other currencies in the world were linked to the dollar. But it was still, since it began with gold, it was still kind of sort of a gold standard. But the U.S. wanted to fund the Vietnam War and the Great Society social programs at the same time in the 1960s and 1970s. That required them to create a lot of new dollars and send them out into the world. And the trading partners of the U.S. were getting too many dollars, more than they wanted. And they were coming back to the U.S. and said, let us convert these into gold, because the U.S. was required to do that with its trading partners, give them gold for dollars. And the U.S. finally, under Richard Nixon in 1971, said, no, I don't think we're going to do that anymore. And they closed the gold window. That was the term for it back then. It was supposed to be a temporary measure to keep speculators from threatening the value of the dollar. But of course, once the governments of the world found themselves with currencies that they could create in unlimited quantities. In other words, they could create money out of thin air with all the power and freedom that that implies. Nobody wanted to go back. So since 1971, all the big countries of the world have had currencies that they could just create out of thin air on an electronic printing press or a physical printing press and use it for stuff. And so the US today has a globe-spanning military empire and a cradle-to-grave entitlement system paid for with borrowed money, basically. In other words, money we create to finance the debt that we take on in order to fund our social programs. And that's led to a spectacular boom. You know, most people look back on the last 50 years as a time of relative prosperity because stocks were going up and house prices were going up and people's jobs were paying them more money year after year. But what it was we were creating too many pieces of currency. And that was changing basically the measuring stick that we use to value things out there. And those things were going up in price, not in value, but in price, because the value of the dollar and the euro and the yen and pound sterling and the Chinese yuan, they were all going down in value. And so now we're at the end point or close to the end point in that experiment because we've gotten all the good stuff out of going deeply into debt. You know, when you borrow money, you feel rich for a little while, and all your neighbors think you're rich because you bought a bunch of stuff with the credit cards you're maxing out. Well, that's what we're doing as a society, as a global society. And so now comes the hard part, where we've taken on immense amounts of debt to, fight all the wars we want to fight and buy off all the constituencies to win all the elections. And now the cost of that debt is becoming the main aspect of our financial system. The US government has taken on tens of trillions of dollars in just the last 30 or 40 years of new debt. That debt is costing us over $1 trillion a year just in interest right now. And so on different scales, it's the same thing in Europe, it's the same thing in Japan. And so you're looking at a lot of governments facing the potential of bankruptcy now, because if they keep interest rates really low in order to minimize their debt costs, then inflation picks up. In other words, people see that the currency is being inflated away and they don't want to hold it anymore, so they buy real stuff, and that makes the price of real things go up, which we know of as inflation. So the value of the currency starts to plunge if interest rates are held too low, which is what happened in the last few years. But if you raise interest rates to prevent your currency from just evaporating, then the interest cost on the debt that you've taken on becomes ruinous. And that's where we are now. We're vastly over indebted in every major society around the world except for Russia. And the interest costs on that debt are becoming overwhelmingly painful, while inflation is above target. So we're in a situation now where no matter what we do, we make one problem worse by trying to fix another problem. And that's for years, sound money people have been saying, well, someday we'll be in this box where there's no fix and then everything will blow up. We're in that box now. We're in kind of a death spiral financially. And that's why things suddenly seem so disturbingly hopeless and we seem so incompetent, is because we've reached the point where there's no fix.
Yeah, we're paying for years and years and years of mistakes that are now piling up to the point where if you fix one side, the other side blows up.
Yes, and it was predictable. If you knew anything about human nature in 1971, when we said, "Oh, well, we'll just have currencies that are what we say they are, and we'll create as much as we need to run the government the way we want it," you probably could forecast that we'd end up in a place like this.
Yeah.
Grossly over indebted, headed for a gigantic financial crisis. But apparently back then they were enjoying having the power to make money out of thin air so much that they didn't pay attention to the consequences.
In a system that basically says you're elected for 4 years or for 8 years at most, you sort of like say, okay, let me show up with a lot of results by borrowing money that someone else has to pay back, right? And I think that becomes reality. So let me try to state this again, but in doing so, see if I understood you correctly. So it's almost like if a society wants to buy new things, they need to buy cement and copper and steel and whatever to be able to build things or to buy things for the society. You look into your safe and you say, I have $100 for copper, then I'll buy copper for $100. Post Nixon, post the end of the gold standard, is you looked in the safe, you didn't find the $100. So what did you do? You printed them, right? You basically the government was like, yeah, you know what? I have the printing press. I might as well create 100 more. Now, here's the question: isn't that what the government is supposed to do anyway? I mean, most people think that money comes from government. Government is supposed to build money, or give us money somehow. So why is that a problem? You basically said it's because it's not linked to gold, so it's not linked to anything specific, right? So it basically means that I had $1,000 yesterday. Now I have a 1,100 because I printed 100, but the value of all the things that back this up is still 1,000. That basically means every dollar lost a little bit of value when I increased the number. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, there's one more aspect of the gold standard that I should have mentioned that I didn't, so I'll mention it now. When you link your currency to something that is real and can't be created out of thin air and is therefore kind of rare, that limits the number of new pieces of currency you can create. Say you're backing the US dollar with 40% gold. That means the number of dollars outstanding can never go above the reciprocal of 40%. So that limits the supply of currency. And since gold, we basically get gold by mining it. We get it out of the ground. And we usually increase the amount of gold that exists by about 1% per year.
Yeah.
So being on a gold standard means your currency can never increase in supply by more than 1% a year. And since human populations have increased by about 1% a year, that means the amount of money per capita didn't go up for 200 or 300 years. And that means prices of things cannot go up. In fact, in a sound money system, you have deflation. Prices go down as we get more productive. We learn how to do things better in the context of a fixed money supply. Mm-hmm. And so a healthy society has prices go down each year. And that's one of the ways you can tell that we're an unhealthy society, because prices go up each year. But yeah, the reason people don't get this is because there's been no reason to understand it. We've had 50 years of what they call a credit super cycle, when the amount of debt was being raised year after year after year, and people were benefiting from it on paper. In other words, your house was getting more expensive. Your stock portfolio was going up. And one more very important aspect of inflation is that it affects different generations differently. So the people who were there on the ground floor, which is to say the baby boomers and the post-World War II generation, they bought their houses when they were cheap. They bought their stock portfolios when they were cheap, and they benefited from all the credit we created that raised the value of financial assets. So boomers got very rich. My generation, really made out from the inflation that we engineered by having, fiat currency. And successive generations have found it harder and harder to get by, because look at millennials right now and think about their ability to buy the house that their parents bought as a starter house. And that house is now $450,000, and there's a 7% mortgage on it, which costs more than the average millennial makes to buy. So my generation have kind of screwed over our kids and grandkids by generating a big inflation that benefited us and hurting them in the process. So that's one of the really despicable things about a currency that the government controls and that the government inflates away, is that it helps one group of people, the politicians who are there, the people who own houses, own fine art and farmland and stock portfolios, but it hurts everybody else.
But that's also a very interesting angle to this, which is the fact that even if you were a baby boomer, but you didn't participate in the debt lifestyle, you wouldn't have been able to buy that house. So, if you remember in the early years of sort of like Robert Kiyosaki's Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and the whole idea of, buy a house, mortgage it, and then the value of the house will increase more than the money that you're paying into the interest. And basically, you're sort of, if you rent it, you're getting the house for free and so on. Is sort of like encouraging everyone to participate in that debt, funding approach. Basically, if you waited as a baby boomer until you were 35 when you had enough money to actually buy what you want, you were by definition losing the value of all of that inflation that was happening, that others who participated in the debt society benefited from.
Yes, and this is another really negative aspect of a period of inflation like we've lived through, is that it encourages you to borrow money. Because if you see that the currency is losing value, which is
Correct.
to say that house prices are going up and stocks are going up, it encourages you to take on as much debt as possible, buy as much house or as many stocks or as much farmland or oil wells or whatever as possible, because they're going to become more valuable with time. So you get a society where taking on immense amounts of debt becomes ingrained at every level of society. It's not just something that the government does or big companies do. It's basically everybody sees it as a way to progress financially. In other words, to build something.
Yeah.
Because like you said, the house is going to go up more in value than your mortgage interest rate costs you. So in the end, you end up with home equity that for a lot of people, over the last 50 years, their home equity was basically the one financial decision that they did in their lifetime.
Correct.
And that was enough. If you bought a house in California in 1959 and just lived in it,
yeah,
you're a multimillionaire now. And you didn't have to do anything else. All you had to do was pay that mortgage off,
yeah,
and then just cover your taxes and your food and stuff like that. And you're a millionaire. So that kind of an idea, and call that one aspect of the American dream. People just assumed that that was the case in my generation. But ask a millennial or a Gen Zer about something like that, and they'll say, "No, that's first of all, I can't afford the house. Second of all, there's no way that house goes up in value enough to cover my immense mortgage.
Yeah.
So I would be crazy to buy a house even if I could." They're right also, because they came in so late that the game is over.
Mm.
And that's why politics around the world, one reason why politics is so dysfunctional now, is that you've got this huge generation of people who don't feel like the system works for them. They no longer trust the people in charge to make decisions that benefit them, because the people in charge are making decisions that benefit basically an aristocracy now. We've got 1 or 2% of the people out there who own all the assets. So when there's inflation and stocks, bonds, and real estate go up in value, that rich 1% gets even richer. And the people who are working for a living find that their wages don't keep up with the cost of living. And so they actually regress. And that's where we are now. We got 50% of the country in the US regressing. They're getting poorer each year instead of richer, while a handful of people are getting immensely rich right now.
So this is a very, very eye-opening remark here, because if you are rich and you own assets today, inflation makes you richer. By definition, those assets are going to continue to go higher. And so if you have a house worth $1 million, it becomes $1.2 million. You're making more money, while everyone who's being paid minimum wage, who doesn't have that asset, is now further and further away from the dream of ever buying a house, because houses are becoming more expensive. So, one side is getting richer and the other is getting poorer. And that unfortunately becomes a question on the politician who needs to make a choice. Usually they make the choice to benefit the richer, but knowing that by doing that, they're, really penalizing the poorer.
I'm not even sure the politicians know that, because they live in Washington, D.C., or at least the federal politicians, and they talk to other rich people all day long. They spend their day talking to constituents, trying to get them to give money to their campaigns, and lobbyists who speak for the pharmaceutical companies and the defense companies and the big banks. So I think we've basically, by this point, we've created an aristocracy of people who basically benefit from all the forces that we've talked about, and who dictate government policy to keep that gravy train rolling. To take one of many examples, well, let me go through just a few of the weird statistics now. A handful of big banks basically own the financial system right now. And when a new president comes in, he takes somebody from Goldman Sachs or Citigroup to run the Treasury Department and the Fed. And so they continue government policies that benefit their old employers and their future employers. The military-industrial complex basically dictates U.S. foreign policy, which is why we have all these wars, because wars are incredibly profitable for Raytheon and General Dynamics. And then they take some of the billions of dollars they make, hand it back to political campaigns to reelect the politicians who started our forever wars. And it just goes in a cycle like that. And, big food sells us stuff that's not really food that makes us sick, but they make a fortune doing it. The big pharmaceutical companies sell us drugs that treat the symptoms of the lifelong chronic illnesses that the processed food that we eat causes. And then they funnel the money back into advertisements on CNN and campaign contributions to the people who fund HSA or Health and Human Services in the US. And it just goes on and on. It's one feedback loop after another that we have created because we have a non-sound currency, because we gave the government the ability to create money out of thin air. They hand that money to the big banks, who hand it to their favorite clients, who get richer and richer, and then in effect end up controlling the government. And that's where we are. Every election basically puts the same people back in charge. Their policies never change. And the 1% gets richer and richer, while the bottom 50% gets poorer and poorer, until we end up with something like a French Revolution kind of rebellion. That's what I think the billionaire class is most afraid of now, is something literally like a French Revolution. There's some funny stories associated with that. I'll do those later if we have time.
I want to come back to this, but I really have a question that I think puzzles a lot of people before we go there. So if the government can print dollars, why does it need to borrow? So why is it that there is so much debt, $35 trillion that the US owes, in treasury bonds, sort of, to foreign countries and foreign, rich people? Why?
Well, actually, it's kind of a fig leaf to hide what we're really doing. There's an economic idea called modern monetary theory that says what you just said, that, if we can create money out of thin air, why are we borrowing money, then paying interest on those bonds and taxing people to cover that interest, when we could just create as much money as the government needs, and print it or create it electronically and just run the government that way? The answer is that we actually already do that. But we're pretending that we don't do that, because what we do now is the government borrows a bunch of money, and then uses that to fund its wars and its cradle to grave entitlement systems, et cetera, et cetera. And then it creates money via the Federal Reserve in order to buy those bonds and cover the interest on those bonds. So yeah, we could skip the whole two big steps of borrowing and taxing, and just create the money that we're creating and have exactly the same world that we have now. But the governments of the world don't want voters to know that we're just financing the government from money we create out of thin air. Because, the fatal flaw in that is the sentence, the government will create as much money as it needs, right? Because it gets to define how much it needs, and its needs are infinite once it starts really thinking about it. So if we went to just modern monetary theory, we just got rid of taxes and got rid of debt, our after-tax income would be higher, and we would be happy for about 3 years, until it dawned on everybody that the government is now creating twice as much money as it used to create, because there's no political price for it so far to create insane amounts of money. It's handing money out to everybody in sight. It's, we've invaded 3 new countries in the past year, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the dollar begins to plunge in value as everybody sees this. And then it dies. There's a concept called the crack-up boom in a school of thought called the Austrian School of Economics. And it says that with an unsound currency, which is what we have today, you eventually reach a point where a critical mass of people figure out that it's explicit government policy to make the currency worth less a little bit at a time, year after year, in order to make the debt manageable. And those people react to that the way you would think. They get rid of that currency as soon as they get some. They get paid and they turn their paycheck into real stuff like
Yes.
farmland and gold and silver and that, et cetera. And that causes those things to spike in price, which is to say it causes the dollar to collapse in value, and the system dies. And we are very close to that right now. We're just a few basically lines of semantics away from people figuring that out. Just a couple more betrayals on the part of the aristocracy of a couple more groups of people, and we're there.
Yeah.
So I think that's the coming decade for the financial world, and by implication, the political world and the geopolitical world. We've got chaos coming, and it's because we screwed up our currency on such a vast scale that people are just going to give up on it in the not too distant future.
So what you're saying is really a very, very real thing, that there is no value to keeping the dollar today, that you basically are better off buying a car, even if the car depreciates a little bit, because you are eventually you have very little trust that that this currency will hold its value at all. That basically, if you keep your money in the bank today, the declared inflation is that you may lose, say, 5% or whatever. But the reality is that because of all of the money that's being printed on top of that, that might not be measured yet, but that's coming back to you, you may be losing more. And I have to ask you a question from someone who hasn't lived in the US. From an outside the US point of view, it becomes really, really clear that for a very long time, we paid for the US lifestyle, right? We were basically, the US was basically, having a free dinner at the expense of all of us. And I think that's, again, something that most people don't understand, that by the US printing money, forcing every country in the world to use the dollars to trade things like oil and so on, basically countries around the world would have to take that money that the US printed, keep that as a reserve, because it's the only way they can buy the commodities that they need. And as a result, all of that new additional, dilution of the currency is actually borne on the Chinese side, or on the, on the, Middle Eastern side, or whatever. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the dollar is the world's reserve currency. And that is what has allowed the US to get away with what we've gotten away with, because everybody in the world needs dollars. That's where that's your risk-free asset. So if you have some extra money, you can put it in local currency, but you don't necessarily trust your local government.
Yeah.
But you put it in dollars, and the value will still be there going forward. At least that's how it's been perceived in the past. But that is starting to go away because, as you said, we have been able to get away with a lot of things because other people have been willing to take dollars, and that has allowed us to behave in ways that we wouldn't be able to behave otherwise. You can say it's mathematically correct that we borrow our military budget from China. And
that's such an interesting statement. It's true, but
it is true.
See it that way. It's such an interesting statement.
Yeah, and from China's point of view, that's less and less of a good deal, right?
Correct. And by the way, you also import all the microchips that you need in your weapons from Taiwan.
Yes. Yeah.
Interesting.
Which that could be the start of World War III at some point here, if we figure out that's our flashpoint. But what's happening around the world now is that other countries are starting to figure this out. See, it used to be that if you ran a trade surplus with the US, in other words, you gave us real stuff and we gave you dollars, that you would take those dollars, you would buy treasury bonds, which are government debts. So in effect, you would lend that money back to the US government, and you would hold those treasury bonds in your central bank foreign exchange reserves, which you use to back your currency. Well, that's suddenly not such a good deal for a lot of countries for two reasons. One is that we're clearly making the dollar less valuable year after year, so it's not necessarily a store of value anymore to hold treasury bonds. And the other is that holding treasury bonds has become kind of a political statement because the US is using the dollar as a weapon.
Yeah.
Anybody that steps out of line from what the US empire tells them to do gets punished financially in some way. We'll kick your banks out of the SWIFT international bank settlement system, or we'll put sanctions on your exporting industries and not let them sell their oil or uranium or whatever. And a lot of countries who would like to, if not become world powers, but at least have some autonomy in their own neighborhood, find that very frustrating. So what's happening now is central banks around the world are selling their treasury bonds and buying gold because gold is a neutral asset. It's the old kind of money that we all used to have, and it's not, by buying gold, you're not necessarily making a statement that you're on one side or another in the coming global geopolitical crisis between the U.S., Russia, and China. So you can back your currency with something that will probably do much better than dollars going forward, and you don't have to choose a side in the coming World War III. So a lot of countries are doing that. They're buying gold, and they're selling treasury bonds. And so that sounds an awful lot like the crack-up boom that I described before.
Yeah.
When they get money, they dump their dollars and they buy something that is real, that's going to hold its value better than currencies do.
So what happens to all of those dollars?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because they in a lot of cases come back to the U.S. If somebody dumps treasury bonds, somebody else is buying those treasury bonds for dollars, and then maybe they get sent back to the U.S. in exchange for real U.S. assets.
Yeah.
In other words, the money, let's say there's 10 trillion US dollars sloshing around in the world now. And if that comes back to the US, even $5 trillion of it, into real stuff, into Miami condos or Kansas farmland or oil wells in Texas or whatever, that pushes the price of all those things up, which is to say, it pushes the value of the dollar down. So that's the big short-term risk for this trend out of treasury bonds and into gold, is that it makes the dollar weaker, other things being equal, and it brings us closer to the point where we perceive that the dollar is no longer a store of value, and we just shouldn't be in it. And there's an organization called the BRICS countries that is kind of leading the way here. BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And they're forming a separate monetary union that doesn't require the dollar, just totally bypasses the dollar for a lot of kinds of trade, and is threatening to set up a gold-backed currency that those countries will use for trade among themselves. That'll be, backed by gold. Therefore, it will be a sound currency that will hold its value, and it'll allow them to continue to dump their dollars on the open market. So that's, it's a long-term risk to the U.S., but it is a very real risk, because the BRICS countries, they own a lot of natural resources. They're powerful countries.
Yeah, I mean, in a very interesting way, the real risk was that, before the Ukraine-Russia war, if you wanted to buy oil and gas, even from Russia, you would have to pay in dollars. And so there was value to the dollar. Now, I think 92% of all the trade between Russia and China is now done in their local currencies, which basically removes all of the need for the US dollar there. And I think the idea that you're describing of the dollar coming back is actually really interesting for people to understand. So the way I normally try to explain it is, imagine if you walked into a supermarket and there were 2 bottles of Coke left, and each of them is $1, and someone walked in very thirsty, had $2 ready to buy them, when someone else walked in with $3, very thirsty, ready to buy them, the price of the 2 bottles has just immediately come up to 3. It's as simple as that, because he has the money, he has the need, and basically he will take the price up. And I think when you mention that, if you think of the entire US economy and everything that's available for sale, let's say is $1,000 worth, there is $1,000 in the US competing for it. It remains at $1,000. But if there is, $500 coming back from outside to the US economy, now there is 1,500 chasing everything that was originally worth 1,000, then everything will go up by 50%. Eventually, those dollars have to be allocated. And I think that's actually very much what happened during the COVID time, where people were just given money, in government support, if you want. And basically that money had to find a place to land in, whether that's real estate eventually, whether that's stocks eventually, and that basically kept things going higher.
Yes, exactly. Right now, those dollars aren't here. They're not here trying to buy a lot of US stuff. But if they come back here, it increases the money supply in the US, which like you said, more dollars chasing the same number of things, and that'll push the prices up. So yeah, and that's very probably a process that's in train right now,
Already, yeah.
and will continue. And the COVID thing is also really important because most adults in the US had never experienced real inflation before. 2 or 3% inflation a year is beneath notice, because there was inflation, but it was flowing into financial assets like houses and stocks, which aren't considered inflation in the US. That's considered to be a good thing instead of a bad thing. But in 2022, all that money we created to manage the pandemic lockdowns flowed into everything. It flowed into food and it flowed into rent. And all of a sudden, regular people got to experience double-digit inflation. They saw their living standard rise by about 30% in a lot of cases, or I'm sorry, their
Living
cost of
costs.
living rise by
Yeah.
30% in the space of just 3 or 4 years. So now we're a very different population in the US and in a lot of other places in the sense that we know inflation is a real thing. We know it's possible. We understand how it works. And we are terrified that we're going to have to go back to hoarding toilet paper from Costco and stuff like that, and not being able to buy a used car that we need to get to work because there are no used cars on the lots for less than $25,000. That scared a lot of people. So it kind of primed them for the other discoveries that they're going to make now as we figure out on every level that our government can't be trusted. And the biggest part of the government that can't be trusted is the financial system.
Mm.
So what do we do? And so, I have a Substack newsletter where the goal is to find actionable ideas for how to deal with this when it starts to happen, because it looks inevitable. Barring World War III or aliens landing or something like that, the financial crisis is going to flow from our past mistakes. It's pretty easy to lay out in terms of this happens, then this happens, then this happens. So the question is, how do you protect yourself and your family from something like that? That you've never had to think about before. These are new ideas. How do you prep? And what should you do? What skills should you acquire? What investments should you have? So it's suddenly interesting to a lot of people because they now accept that a crisis of that form is possible. Because they experienced something like that in 2022.
So I definitely want to come to the question of, so what do we do about that? But I have one more question before we go there. It's sad for me to say this because I have tons of American friends and I did business in America for so long. But it's clear in my mind that what's happening is, as you rightly said, the rich society is unaffected by this, even benefiting a little bit. And if that society collapses, they have global mobility. They don't really have an issue to stick to the US other than maybe to diversify their assets outside the US and their currency outside the US dollar. But the typical American citizen today is really, really, really struggling, right? In my mind, I think the way BRICS is moving, and especially after the US aggravates the entire world by, putting sanctions on Russian money, that basically gets everyone to distrust the idea that I can keep my money in US related assets and that it's still my money, makes everyone move away from those assets. As a matter of fact, not just governments, but a person like me, for example, where now Citibank blocks my account every 2.5 weeks because some regulation of some sort is saying, ask him for more KYC, ask him for more KYC, which is in a way really, really understandable in a society where we need to keep financial systems safe. But the question of blocking my money makes it not my money, it makes it the bank's money unless I comply to what the bank wants. And I think the whole world is waking up to this, that the big bully is not safe to be around anymore. And so I can easily see that the US citizen is going to suffer from that the BRICS will continue, that the US dollar will continue to devalue, that debt will be a very easy way for the US government to try and pay some of the interest by printing $1 trillion more every year to pay the interest and so on. But my question is, how does that ricochet back to the world? So what happens to other societies that used to depend on the US economy, or to trade with the US economy when that starts to happen in the US?
Well, yeah, they have the problem that American citizens have, but writ large. In other words, what does India do,
Yeah.
or China, or Taiwan? Like you said, what do they do when they see that the financial system they've depended on for all these decades is no longer going to function the way that they're used to it functioning? And so they, in a very real sense, they have to prep in the same way that an individual American has to prep against the dollar crisis that's kind of inevitable now. And one of the things that they're already doing is buying a lot of gold. Central banks are aggressive buyers of gold right now, much more
Yeah.
so than any time in the past. India, so far this year, their silver imports are 8 times higher than in 2023.
Wow.
So they're doing that one thing. They're bringing in a lot of precious metals that whatever they do with them, they will tend to hold their value and they'll be a source of wealth. China is encouraging its citizens to buy gold. Um, in I think it's Korea, you can buy gold in vending machines in
Yeah.
convenience stores.
Yeah.
So a lot of the world is already doing that particular thing, and then weaning themselves off dollars for trade is another thing that's pretty obvious. You know, if you're trading, if you're selling oil to China, then you take yuan instead of demanding dollars via an intermediate step now. Of course, that's not ideal, which is why there might be a gold-backed currency at some point that the BRICS countries use, so they don't have to trust the currencies of the dictatorships or who are the main members of the BRICS coalition. But yeah, you know, if you're in another country, weaning yourself off the need for dollars is a very quick, very simple way to protect yourself partially from what's coming. And you know, you see it happening all around the world. So, and here's what's interesting though, or one of the interesting things is that doesn't mean US assets will fall in value. So it's possible that weaning yourself off the dollar might involve buying US assets
Because they
because
will
as
go
if the
up.
dollar, yeah, because they will go up in dollar terms, and that protects you against a devaluation of the dollar. So, you know, if you buy a San Francisco condo or something like that, if you're in Japan or China, it's an understandable asset that you own. You know, it's not anything that you really have to go out of your way to figure out. You know how that works. So you just buy it, you leave it empty, and then you know that 10 years from now you're going to come back to it and it's going to have some value. You know, it won't just evaporate. It may go down in real terms, in dollar terms, but it's still going to be a valuable asset with utility. And the U.S. is the least likely country to be invaded and you know, blow up your condo. That's least likely to happen in the U.S. than anywhere else.
Oh,
So it makes sense. So in a weird kind of way, what's happening with the dollar actually attracts capital from the rest of the world.
but isn't it possible that, because there are no more buyers, because the economy is struggling in the US, that the price of that condo will go down?
Yeah, well, real estate is a cyclical asset. And it used to be that it would just stop going up during recessions, but in the last recession, in 2008, 2009, house prices tanked in the United
Yeah.
States.
Yeah.
And today's house prices are much higher than they were back during that bubble, that
Yeah.
real estate bubble. So yeah, I think home prices in the US are due to fall. But I think that what comes after what will probably be a deflationary recession of the next year or two, just because we've taken on so much bad debt that we have to have a recession because consumers are out of money, everything's too expensive, consumer spending will go down, the economy will slow down, we'll have a recession, we'll have an equities bear market, all of that will happen, and it'll take real estate down with it. But coming out of that, the Fed will try to inflate its way out of the recession, and then we get even more inflation. And in that case, yeah, a house or a condo in a border city or a coastal city in the US may not keep up with the depreciation of the dollar, but it will hold some of its value. It'll
Hold some of
remain
the
an
value.
asset with some value.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people, if you're trying to get your money out of Russia right now or Brazil or someplace like that, protecting some of your money is better than losing all of your money.
Correct. Yeah.
So in that sense, and that's basically what's been driving up the price of a lot of US assets all along, and Canadian assets, by the way, is people around the world who are willing to take a 30% loss in real purchasing power in order to protect the other 70%. and they're buying real estate or condos and oil wells and things like that. And that to them is a good deal, because they made so much money with whatever kind of corruption they were engaging in their home country, that 70% of that, they'll take it.
Yeah. So when you give advice, you normally say precious metals, assets, are better than currency in the coming time, right? But that assumes that someone already has money. There are so many people around the world and many listening to us right now who are barely making ends meet. So what advice would you have in the coming economy for someone who's not made it yet, who's not part of the baby boomer society that has the money and now is worried about not losing it?
Yeah, there are 50% of the U.S. population is in the boat that you just described there, where they don't have any real savings. So they're not going to go out and just buy $100,000 worth of gold or silver. That's completely beyond them. There are other things they can do though, because you basically, look at how your grandparents lived. And then and look at how resilient they probably were, because they had a garden that maybe provided 20 or 30% of their food. They knew some of the other farmers that they got milk and eggs and beef from. And so they had a network of people who were who would watch their back, and then they watched those people's backs. In other words, they were parts of communities that we've kind of gotten away from that now. Life has been so good in the US that we've taken on the idea that we can basically manage on our own. We can move to a new place. I live in a place with a lot of retirees, for instance, and a lot of them moved from their homes to buy a nice house in this area without necessarily knowing anybody. They were just, they had money. They wanted to be in a pretty place, and they moved here. But let a gigantic financial crisis happen 2 years from now, and they are not going to have the kind of network that you need. So I think step number one is wherever you are, wherever you're starting from, try to become more of a part of the community than you are now. Step number two, look at the things that you could provide for yourself that you now buy at exorbitant prices. Food is one, repair services is another. If you can kind of sort of become a handyman, you're not only more self-sufficient, but you're in demand in your neighborhood. All of a sudden you got a part-time job there. If you can, rewire a socket, or if you can fix a car so it doesn't have to be into the dealer, any number of things that our grandparents used to be able to do just because, it's what you know how to do, and we've gotten away from that. And there's a TV show called, it's a cartoon about a small town in Colorado. And in that small town, the people with college degrees and nice houses and everything didn't know how to fix their stuff. So they were always calling the handyman. And there weren't enough handymen in town to handle all the business. So prices of handyman type jobs started going up until they became the economic elite of that town. They became the rich guys, the handymen did. And that's an extreme example of what's coming. But we are coming to a point where being able to work with your hands and fix real things is a very in-demand profession. So, learn how to fix things yourself.
Back to basics.
Advise your kids who are thinking about maybe getting a psych degree or a history degree or something like that. Advise them to go into become an electrician or a plumber or something like that, because those are the things that will hold their value going forward in terms of skill sets and careers. So they call something there's a thing called skill stacking in employment advising. And that's a thing where you take what you can do right now and you add some skill to that. If you're a computer programmer, learn public speaking. If you're pretty much anything, learn some basic electrical stuff or plumbing or whatever. And that makes you more self-sufficient and better able to manage when things get tricky.
I think that's amazing, actually. When I started to really look at the way the economy is going, I searched YouTube quite a bit for advice on how to survive the Great Depression, right? And it's quite puzzling for me that the actual things that people did back at that time were very much in line with what you're saying here. The way people survived the worst economic time in our modern history was they became closer to the community. They went back to basics, saved a little going into it. Whoever saved a little going into it hopefully turned it into something that they didn't appreciate, did fared out better. And basically everyone went back to basics. It's like, I'll fix your car, but cook, my kids a meal or whatever. And I think it's quite interesting. Hopefully we will not get to a point where it's that dramatic or drastic, but definitely, I think we need to wake up from the current lifestyle where, if everything is disposable, every thing that you want to buy or shop is one click away. You don't really think about that. Every one of those dollars, every one of those habits, every one of those skills will matter, I think, very much in the next few years.
Yes, absolutely. The cartoon I was thinking of was South Park. That's the
Is
TV
it?
show
Come on.
about the handyman. Yeah. I can't believe I couldn't remember South Park. But yeah, if you look at our grandparents' lifestyle, that's a much more appropriate lifestyle for today than it has been for the past 50 years, because things have been so easy. Growing up in the 1980s and 1990s was probably literally the best time in human history to grow up.
In the
Because
US.
in the US, yeah, because there were jobs that paid pretty well. Real estate was pretty cheap. Most investments hadn't started their multi-decade bull runs yet. So everything was relatively easy. And we got the idea that that's how it would always be, and that we didn't have to do any of these kind of grubby, messy things. We just pay somebody to take care of it all. In other words, we became kind of little mini aristocrats in our own way. We have servants to handle this. It wasn't a live-in servant, but the car mechanic fixed the car for us. Maybe a maid comes in once a week and cleans the house, and a handyman rewires whatever needs rewiring or does some drywall for us or whatever. So we had basically kind of Uber version of servants. You call them up and they come over and they take care of stuff. And we paid them what in today's terms is pretty good money to do that. And so we probably have to go back to the days when we take care of most of what we take care of. And also another thing we did was we kind of fragmented as families, where back in our grandparents' day, maybe 2 generations or even 3 generations lived in the same house, which is incredibly economical when you think about it. You're sharing one piece of real estate among 8 people instead of 2 people. And I think we're going to have to go back to that again, in part because baby boomers now, a lot of them are kind of stuck in their McMansions because they've got 4,000 square foot, 3-story houses that, and they've got sore knees and sore hips, so they can't really get up and down, but they've got a 3% mortgage on a house like that, which is super cheap. And where else are they going to, and anyhow, they aren't selling their houses the way demographically it usually plays out. Usually by the time a generation hits an average of 70 years old, they start dumping their houses on the market, and that crashes real estate prices. But that's not happening. And one way that could play out is that the kids and the grandkids, instead of grandma and grandpa moving out, the kids and the grandkids move back in with them. And that's one way of solving the I can't buy a house problem for millennials and Gen Zers. And I think that's something that we're going to see on a vast scale. And it's not because we just wake up and think, oh, let's get us all into one house. I really want to live that way. We'll think of that because all of a sudden we can't afford our current lifestyles. And you'll lose your job or whatever, or your stock portfolio will tank, or lots of things will happen to make you much less rich than you think you are. Oh, pensions. We haven't talked about pensions yet. Public sector pensions are everywhere, and in the US, and people think that they're going to make X amount of money from their public sector pension, but they're not. Those pensions are going to go bust. And that's going to lead a lot of people to think, all right, well, let's get a couple generations together in this house and see if we can survive that way. So that's another thing that's coming, and prepping. Someone who's prepping for a crisis might want to get in front of that by thinking about it now.
How bad do you think it will get, John? I mean, I have to say, it's Slow-Mo. My podcast has always been, the point where you come for reflection and for, thinking about things that would improve your mental health and make you feel better about life. I'm choosing to do this mini series that, it's not what they told you, because I think it's time for people to really become aware and prepare for what is about to happen. But how bad is it? Like, how deep will we get into recession, you think? How long will it take us? Is this 1929 again, or is it 2008?
It's definitely worse than 2008 because the numbers are so much bigger. We got ourselves out of the Great Recession in that decade by borrowing insane amounts of new money on top of
100%.
the insane amounts of money that we borrowed before. So, because the numbers are much bigger, the consequences have to be much bigger. But the specifics are tough because we're kind of at a choice. We're at a crossroads right now where we have two crises, two different kinds of crises. And we can't avoid any crisis, but we have to basically choose now which of these big crises we're going to have. And one, like you said, could be the 1930s. That's where we basically keep money creation under control. We allow interest rates to go up, and that bankrupts a lot of people and causes a lot of the bad debt to blow up. And so we have a deflationary depression in which the debt is wiped out by default. In other words, lots of people go bankrupt, their debt ceases to exist, they're impoverished, their families are impoverished, and we have this brutal decade in which 90% of the population feels as poor as they've ever felt and as hopeless as they've ever felt. So we have that. Or we try to inflate our way out of this, which is what a lot of economists seem to want to do now, where we just create as much new money as it takes to make today's debt less onerous. In other words, if the value of the dollar goes down, the dollars that you have to pay to cover that debt are less expensive, and it's
Right.
a cheaper process for you to get out from under the debt. That will be a catastrophe. That'll be something like
100%.
Weimar Germany in 1924, when currency just became worthless. You know, where you take a suitcase full of it to the grocery store, or you burn it to heat your house or something. Um, and I think that's what we want to do. Or not what we want to do, but those are the choices that our governments are making. Because you, as you mentioned right at the beginning of this talk, that's the easy way out. You know, it's easy for a politician who's going to retire in 2 years to generate a little extra inflation right now, then retire and leave the consequences, the much more serious consequences, to their successors. So
Mm.
that's what we're doing right now. So I think we have a currency crisis. In other words, we have a time when the dollar loses so much of its value that it ceases to function in the way that a form of money has to function to be valid. And now that could lead to two things. One is, you know, that hyperinflation that I mentioned, the Weimar Germany scenario, in which everybody who trusts the government is impoverished because their life savings just disappears. Or we could have a monetary reset, which is we just get rid of the old system and impose a new one. Like on some Sunday night, the government just announces that from now on, the dollar is it's a name for 1/10,000th of an ounce of gold. And it will be henceforth convertible to gold in any government office anytime you want to. And the money supply is going to be limited to the increase in the amount of gold that the US government has, which is to say that the money supply is going to be basically fixed. So no more inflation going forward, sound money. It's a system that works in the future, but at a cost of, again, impoverishing everybody who trusts the government. If you got a bank account in dollars and they make the dollar worth 1/8 of what it is today in real terms, in purchasing power terms, then you became a lot less rich than you thought you were,
Right.
or you became dirt poor. And so we have to get through the political unrest that comes from that, because there's no way to do this painlessly. And I think a lot of people are going to be enraged by that. And so we have to somehow, some way, get through the 2 years of incredible political unrest without some kind of a violent revolution for that to work. But if we can make it work, that's the least painful way of getting out from under this. There is no pain-free way, but that way would be one that gives us a viable monetary system going forward.
It's quite interesting what you just said, because so I've seen this in my lifetime in many countries, in Argentina, in Turkey, now in my home country, Egypt, where basically the currency is just completely, devalued in a way that, when the Yanni Turkish lira, the new Turkish lira comes out,
Mm-hmm.
it disrupts the economy, but then it really stabilizes the economy. I think the challenge with that is that now the Turkish lira is depreciating again so fast because the habits that created the original depreciation have not changed, right? And I think in a very interesting way, as you go at the core of it, perhaps the biggest reform is for the U.S. government to stop borrowing, to actually stop having a budget deficit, to stop investing in the war machine that's killing everyone around the world. Big bully basically financing it from the money. I mean, the statement you said is just incredible. Financing the war machine from the money paid by China, right? And it's quite interesting because eventually the US, if Trump gets elected, will go like, okay, and now we're going to have a war with China. No, you're not. You don't have the capabilities to do it if you go that way. And I think it's interesting that perhaps without fixing the underlying issue of that constant supply of money that is not backed with anything, you're really never going to get out of that hole, basically.
Yeah. Well, see, that's one of the big issues in a monetary reset is it means that henceforth, going forward, you have to live within your means.
Yeah.
And in the US, that would mean that the average lifestyle gets cut by a third or more. We would really have to scale back
and
what
all of
we're
your
able to do and buy.
all of your pensioners completely struggle.
Totally. All the pensioners would see a big cut in their pensions, Social Security and Medicare, as well as teachers' union pensions and things like that. And we'd have to cut the military budget in half. So entitlements would have to be cut dramatically. The military empire would basically have to be scrapped. We'd have to, what do we have now? 180 military bases around the world, or I think it's 400 or 500, depending on whether it's just a presence or an actual base. But we'd have to call the soldiers home, and we'd have to let Asia manage Asia and Europe manage Europe, and we would just have to pull back and be North America. And see, we have people in charge of the U.S. government for whom that is a fate worse than death, literally, because they see themselves as running a global empire that's going to endure for 1,000 years. They're called neocons in the U.S., neoconservatives. Mm-hmm. And they believe that the U.S., with 5% of the world's population, should rule the other 95% of the people in the world in perpetuity, that's just our birthright. And that whatever wars we have to fight now in order to make that happen are totally worth it, because the long-term goal is so amazing. So, got to deal with those guys somehow, because they would not put up with a elimination of the U.S. global military empire. But financially, there's no way that it survives, because we can't pay for it anymore without basically zeroing out Social Security, Medicare, and all other pensions. That would be the mathematical equation that would get us to, maintaining the global empire. And I don't think that's politically possible, obviously. So,
of course. Which candidate do you think can be elected with a campaign that says, "I'm going to make you really suffer"? Right? It's and which candidate gets elected and then actually does any of what they say they were going to do? And at the end of the day, the rich are dictating the agenda.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The donor class runs the country in the US. Yeah. And the only time this will happen, any kind of a resolution, like a monetary reset, will happen when it's the least bad option on a list of extremely bad options. So in other words, if the peasants are metaphorically outside the gates of the castle and there's a million of them, and they're thinking French Revolution or Mussolini or something like that, they're thinking things that would be much worse for you than to give up the power to create money out of thin air. That's when you'll do it. But not till then. I mean, who in their right mind would give up the power to create money out of thin air until their life depends on it?
Can I suggest another alternative, which, I have to say it pains my heart to say it, but it seems to me that everyone is abandoning the US, other than the few, glorified slaves that the US had for quite a bit in the West, right? It seems to me that BRICS is making a very, very powerful, very clear statement that your issues are going to be exported back to you. That we were, I don't know if the numbers are correct, but I think that 30% of the treasury, purchases of China has moved out in the last year into gold. So basically, there is a very gradual and, unstoppable move away from supporting the US policy, supporting the US dollar standard, and basically creating a global economy in the global South that doesn't include the US. And honestly, it's if the US has constantly for the last 50 years been on a trade surplus that basically is funded by the rest of the world, eventually sort of the world will go like, it's your problem now, deal with it. And in a very unusual way, it might seem to me that might mean that the rest of the global economy, there is, almost the inverse of the picture that we've seen for the last 50 years, where the US living standards are constantly going up. Everyone else in the world is becoming poorer, other than perhaps China and a few other players. And that picture reverses, where everyone starts to catch up by trading among themselves, while the US really starts to pay back for the consequences of 50 years of wrong policies.
Yeah, that's a real process that's kind of in place right now, because a lot of what's happening with the BRICS countries is they're doing things that the US objects to, and they're just saying, well, what are you going to do about it? Because look at Ukraine. We started this proxy war in Ukraine to try to weaken Russia. And Russia is now running a nice trade surplus by selling oil to the BRICS countries. And see, that would normally be something that would almost be an act of war from the point of view of the US. But are we going to declare war on China and India at the same time? That's a bridge too far, even for our neocons, I think. And so it's possible that US living standards fall as the rest of the world just kind of ignores it. I mean, I think that's a ways away, because the US financial markets are irreplaceable at the moment. And the dollar remains an important currency for trade and everything. So we're talking longer term. We're not talking at the next BRICS meeting, that this all happens.
No, we're talking 10, 15 years.
Yeah, but it is a trend in that direction.
Yeah.
And I think it's possible that new leaders come into office in the US and just do their best to make up with the rest of the world.
That would be such a nice thing to say. I mean, honestly, with an external view of the US, out of the US, John, it's so interesting to us. Like, literally, a US president could pick up the phone and talk to Putin and say, all right, NATO is not going to expand into Ukraine anymore, and the war would be over, right? And
totally. One phone call.
And it's mind-boggling for us how, but I think you said it really well, that the war machine is a very big economic incentive. And so a lot of people are very interested to keep wars going, to ship, billions of dollars over, because it's a business.
Yeah. In a very real sense, it is a business. It's how politicians get reelected. It's how the CEOs of General Dynamics and Raytheon retire incredibly rich. And they see no reason to stop, because they've either convinced themselves that it's the right thing to do, to continue trying to pacify the world, or they just understand that this is how they make money. This is their job. So I think that especially in terms of some resources, the U.S. has a big problem going forward, because we don't have a monopoly on a lot of things that we need. So, to the extent that the BRICS countries do have a monopoly on some of those things, that's a big issue for the U.S. But now, the optimistic scenario for the U.S. is that we've got an awful lot of geographic advantages, two big oceans on either side of us, and all the farmland in the world you could want in the U.S. and Canada, a young, hardworking workforce in
100%.
Mexico.
Yeah.
So if the U.S. had to stand alone, or North America had to stand alone, we'd be fine. We would definitely be okay.
Honestly, yes.
And I think that might be the best way for this to play out. If the rest of the world said, listen, just go back there and leave us alone.
Sort your stuff, yeah.
Yeah, and we would end up getting richer that way, because if we didn't have to finance $1 trillion a year military empire, then our debt would be less onerous, the currency would be stronger, we'd be massively energy exporting, at least independent, and maybe exporting on a mass scale, and we would be okay. So we have a much more attractive scenario in our hand. It's just right there, just a little bit of different political leadership. We could say, listen, we took on too much debt over the past 30 years. We can't afford to have an empire, so we're just going to pull back. You guys handle you, and we'll handle us. And we're going to drill, baby drill here. We're going to have energy exports that we're going to use to pay off our debts. And we're going to be the agricultural powerhouse of the world. And we're going to sell you cheap wheat as much as you want. We could do all that very easily. And,
what a wonderful
that we're not
scenario.
Means there. That we're not doing it means there's some serious pathology at the top of the country. The aristocrat.
That's such an optimistic scenario. Honestly, this is a wonderful scenario. I mean, in a very interesting way, I think a big chunk of the problem is financing the US lifestyle, whether it's the politician's lifestyle or it's the military establishment's lifestyle, or even just the typical consumer's lifestyle. And it's mind-boggling when you go to the US and compare to the rest of the world. When I worked in California with Google X, I dated a wonderful lady in California. And one day we were having a conversation, and I don't know, spoke about finances somehow. And she said, and I quote, she said, "You have no idea how poor I am, Mo." She said that as she unlocked her SUV and put her iPhone on the dashboard. And I'm like, you have no idea what poor is. Like, really, in all honesty. And by the way, she wasn't exaggerating. For the lifestyle of California, right? That was poor. That was considered poor. And you have to imagine that somewhere in the process of the next 5, 10 years, some of that will have to end somehow. $1 trillion or a $2 trillion military budget will have to end somehow.
Well, one of the real tragedies of today's America is that we don't get very much for all the money we're borrowing and for all the risks we take on around the world. We're not healthy. We're an extremely unhealthy culture. And part of that is the whole, the aristocrats who are in charge of the food and pharmaceutical system have made it that way. They designed us to be fat, lazy, and stupid. So yeah, let's say in the US, you have a job that pays you $60,000 a year. You've got a car, you've got a small house, and you're safe. You don't have to worry about any kind of a rebel force coming over the border or anything like that. But you probably are on 3 different kinds of pharmaceuticals, 2 of which are antidepressants. You've got all kinds of incipient illnesses like heart disease and arthritis and things like that you wouldn't have if you were living a healthy lifestyle. And you're gonna die early and very expensively. And so we're really not getting that much for our wealth. And that's why, that we have a politician, Robert Kennedy Jr. here, who's running or was running for president. And his catchphrase now is "Make America Healthy Again." And I think that resonates with a lot of people, or at least it should, because if we were a healthier society, we would be a lot easier to get along with, I think, for the rest of the world. We'd be a lot less stupid than we are now.
I would agree. I can talk to you for hours. And I actually do. I mean, in many ways, I follow every part of content that you put out on the Substack, out on the on YouTube. I love your brutal honesty. I just will have to say that. And I think your advice is incredibly valuable. I think people need to be awakened to the reality of what's happening and what we can do to take care of ourselves and others. I'm really, really grateful, John. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Mo. I really appreciate that. And let me say one of the good things about it taking so long to play out all this financial stuff is that it's let a lot of very smart people develop a voice in the world.
I agree.
And so you're one of them. And I'm really glad you've got the show you've got. And I think you're doing a lot of good out there.
Thank you so much. And for all of you listening, I really don't mean to scare you with what we're talking about. For most of us who have been studying this for a while, it's not that frightening anymore. Let's just put it this way. We knew this was coming. John has been talking about this for years. And, for most who understand the economics of the world and the illusion of money, we know that this is coming. I think it's about time, even though my message of Slow-Mo has always been to really get you to focus on living a better life, on reflecting on things that matter. As I said before today, this is something that matters. And, John was very, very generous with his advice. If you have money, turn it into either assets or precious metals. Currency itself might be a problem. If you have little, then perhaps try to save, try to change your lifestyle, develop a skill or a craft of some sort, and definitely try to offset some of your spending. We may not have to go through any of that, even though most economists realize that we will. But developing this just keeps you safe if we do go through it. With that, I thank you all so much for giving me the opportunity to meet such incredible people many of which are my heroes. And yeah, I love you all for listening, and I will see you next time.